Welcome to How Ecology Works. In this podcast, we cover all topics in ecology and how you might apply them in your future career. So I'm here with John Gruchy, who works for the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. And John, I've known you for a long time, and I know that you work a lot with private landowners to restore prairie back into native plant communities. And I know one of the problems that you deal with really commonly are trying to get rid of improved pasture grasses. So can you tell us a little bit about the steps that you go through when you're thinking about renovating some of these communities?
Sure, man. That's a good question. And Marcus, you've heard me say this 100 times, but it's just like everything, you answer all the questions with it depends. And obviously it depends a whole lot on what you're starting with, and then also what the landowner's specific goal and objective is. So if it's a landowner that wants bobwhites, we'll go about that slightly differently than maybe if they want deer. And now we actually have a lot of landowners who are interested, in actually restoring a prairie plant community. That's even in number 50 in Mississippi, we actually have people that want to go back to maybe that desired plant community that is that prairie plant community. Now, there's an ecological discussion there, right, Marcus? How far back are we going to be? Who judges? Are we going to go back 12,000 years and be in an ice age? No, I don't know. But anyway, but long and the short is it depends on what the landowner's goal is. And so for the purpose of this discussion, I'll assume they want to restore an actual native prairie plant community. And then it depends on what we're starting with. And so sometimes we actually start with row crop. And in that case, it's actually a little bit more straightforward. It's like starting with a blank slate, and we're going to have to bring in all of our plant material. Usually. Now you can walk away from row crop sometimes and do okay for bobwhite maybe, but you're usually not going to get those, especially the heavy seeded plants that are tough to come in. I know you're doing some work with birds, but if you think on our landscape, we don't really have those plants really available in large amounts for the birds to even consume the seeds. So we usually have to bring in plant material when you're talking about row crop situations. Now, that's not always the case, but usually. The next most common situation is going to be in a pasture grass scenario, like you mentioned. And then last, I'll talk about an actual prairie that is in existence, but maybe has a little bit of pasture grass. So what we're going to assume now is we've got a pasture situation where we're going to restore the prairie. And it's not unlike row crop in that we're usually starting from ground zero. You have to go in, first off, assess what is the pasture grass, and then make a recommendation on a herbicide to eliminate that pasture grass. A lot of people hear me talking about herbicides and they don't like herbicides for some reason. It just depends. They think, why can't we use fire or grazing, soil disturbance, get rid of that pasture grass? Keep in mind that pasture grass is probably from Northern Africa or Europe or somewhere like that. And it just doesn't respond to our disturbance regimes right off. Generally, we're going to have to come in and take that out with a herbicide, and hopefully it can be a selective herbicide.
So when you're saying, when you're saying pasture grass, you're specifically talking about an improved pasture grass where someone has brought it in as a non-native plant species. Could you give us some examples of those?
Yeah. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah. So I just broad stroke and call a lot of them pasture grasses, but there are a ton of non-native grasses or non-native plants that wouldn't fall into that category. But when I talk about pasture grass, I'm primarily talking about tall fescue, which you would not see a lot of in Florida. But I see a lot of tall fescue mixed in with Bermuda grass, common Bermuda, which you're going to see a lot of, and then Bahia grass, which I would imagine you would see quite a lot of. And they have different levels of difficulty, if you will. And so if I have a tall fescue field, that's actually fairly straightforward and really pretty easy to deal with. Bermuda grass is probably the most difficult pasture grass to eliminate. And then Bahia grass is not that hard. So we can actually do a lot with Bahia for reasonable costs and not a lot of time. So the first step is deciding what grass we have, or usually it's a mixture of grasses. Then we go in and treat it with a herbicide, and the timing and this type of herbicide is going to be based on that grass. I'm not really going to go into all that, but this is stuff you can read. I've actually got a document that I can give you that's got them all laid out, the prescriptions, the best prescriptions. But and that's all. It's pretty straightforward science-based, just weed science, man. We're doing the same thing that the row crop guys do, right? We spray different chemicals at different rates and different timings, and we figured out the best recipes. So once you've sprayed the grass, the next thing you got to do is wait. You've got to see what comes back. Sometimes we want to go in and follow that up with a prescribed fire or soil disturbance. It just depends on the landowner's goals and objectives. It depends on what we're working with. Sometimes we also have a brush problem associated with that. Actually, a lot of times in my area of the world, if I'm in a native prairie in Mississippi, it's going to have a green ash problem. So we're going to try to treat that brush problem at the same time. It's usually a herbicide, at least to get it in check so that we can get the fuels right to start using fire. So, we're managing both those problems kind of simultaneously, hopefully with that first herbicide application. Now, I said first because almost always we're going to have some skips, or we're going to have another pasture grass that comes in behind the first herbicide application. And in that case, you've got to assess that problem and do a second herbicide application. So usually it's a herbicide application maybe in the first spring or summer, depending on the grass. And then we follow that up with maybe a fire in the winter to kind of stimulate the seed bank and see what's there to come up. Then that next summer, so the second summer, we assess and we decide if we need another herbicide application. If we're lucky, we don't, but usually we do. Or maybe you just need a spot application. You need to go out there and just treat spots, and that's really ideal. That's great. Then you also want to look what type of good plants came back. Did I get any native prairie remnant plants that I want to hold on to? And almost always we're going to get some type of broom sedge, which is fine. It depends on the soil as to what types of grasses would be appropriate. In most of in Mississippi, we get a lot of spirabolous species that are and aristidas in the thinner soils. And if we get into the heavier soils, we'll get taller grasses, switchgrass, big blue stem, eastern gamma grass. Indian grass is not super common in my prairie, but I mean, it does occur. But we get a little blue stem, again, in kind of those little blue stem is kind of ubiquitous, right? It's in most of those prairie situations. So we'll assess the grass. And then the part that we really have trouble with are the forbs. So sometimes we can get the grass for free and we may just have to bring in forbs from a plant material standpoint. Sometimes we get both. And in general, we try to avoid planting if we can, just from a cost standpoint. Now, if you decide you've got a plant, then your next step is really, picking your plant materials. And that depends on the landowner and what they want to see, exactly what their goal is. You can go as high as $1,000 an acre plant material. The other concern is genetics. A lot of people are concerned about genetics, particularly on the forbs. I would not be concerned about genetics on the grasses because they are wind pollinated. I mean, we know for a fact that pollen can move great distances. So I'm not super concerned. I try not to get the grasses, though, that have been bred for forage. So if you're trying to plant switchgrass, there are some switchgrasses they've manipulated. Gamma grass has been manipulated to be a forage grass, and so they grow taller, more vigorously, that kind of thing. So you do want to avoid those. You could go down a long road with this plant material genetic stuff, and I won't do that. But essentially, it just depends on the landowner's goals and objectives. Most of the time, we're going to get about a $100 to $400 an acre seed mix plant material, and we're going to plant that with a no-till drill. Usually we try to avoid soil disturbance so that we don't stir up the seed bank and release bad stuff. That usually will, in my area of the world, Johnson grass. If you scratch the dirt, you will get Johnson grass. And Johnson grass we can kill it, but it's expensive. It bumps the cost way up. So if we don't disturb the soil and we just have a little bit of Johnson grass, we can spot treat that Johnson grass. But once you disturb the soil, release those rhizomes, it gets to be a much more expensive treatment. So that's just my perspective on prairie restoration in Mississippi. Somebody else could listen to this from Iowa or Central Florida and say, no, he's stupid. I'm going completely off of my experience in North Mississippi in the Black Belt Prairie and Jackson Prairie. So that's, and then once you get the plant material planted, it's going to take a little while, especially some of the harder, heavier seeds, your silphiums, things like that, man, they're going to take 2 or 3 years to really get going. And so you have to do some type of weed control usually, but early in my career, I did a lot of weed control. I was using a lot of herbicides. Once you remove the pasture grass and it's gone, it's not as important as I once thought it was to have, really intense weed control. It just takes time. It'll be a little bit of time for that to work through and then getting your fire regime started. But for sure, you're going to have to eliminate that pasture grass. That's the most critical step.
Okay. So yeah, it sounds like if you're trying to restore a native plant community, it's obviously you need to get rid of the non-native grasses. But even from a wildlife habitat standpoint, it sounds like
Yeah.
that's not only a necessary part, but because of the ecology of those species, it also forces you to use herbicides initially to start the restoration process.
Yes, yeah. And if you have white-tailed deer, you might can live with a little bit of percentage of, if white-tailed deer is your objective, you might can live with a few, 10% cover of fescue or Bermuda grass. If you're a bobwhite guy, you want it all gone so that you're not inhibiting the movement of those chicks. If you're a prairie plant community, you want it all gone. It just all depends on that particular person's goals and objectives. Because the more you want gone, the more it costs.
Sure. All right. Well, I really appreciate you taking time to tell us about that. It's really interesting and insightful, and I know you're the expert on the matter, so that's why I came to you.
Yeah, no problem, man.